All right, good day, Chairman and guest.
Good day.
Ooh. We have with us today what I believe to be one of the foremost experts as it relates to John Mayer gear, equipment, and information. It is none other than the great Justin Jeske. Did I say that right, Justin?
You did. You got it.
Justin Jeske, the pride of Canada. And not only does he have great John Mayer content, I should mention this just as an aside, although we're not going to talk about this today, but we may bring him back for this, is he also is an expert as it relates to John Frusciante of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So this may have to be a separate episode that we do with him in the future that covers similar information. But today, just to give you a quick overview of the things that we're going to be covering with the great Mr. Jeske, is we're going to be talking about John Mayer gear. We're going to be talking about what happens if you clone your rig identically to John Mayer. What happens if you just want to get in the ballpark? What are the key staples that you need? What are some of the best John Mayer tones and solos? What's currently on John Mayer's rig? Is there actually a correlation between John Mayer and Stevie Ray Vaughan, as many people may allude? And what are other great resources for fans of John Mayer and the gear, and they want to know more? Justin, welcome to Chairmen of the Boards.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone.
Awesome.
Welcome.
Awesome. So before we start, any quick pieces of information that we want to gather from the chairman, any comments that we want to make before we start diving in to the John Mayer gear and just making Justin have to go back into the Rolodex and think up all these different answers of questions that we have?
I have a very important one to start. I know we've kind of mentioned John Mayer gear and Rolodexes. Does this include John Mayer Rolexes and his watch collection? Do you know anything about that? I'm not a watch guy, I have to say, but I know he's very into his watches. Are we going to touch on that at all, or is that out of bounds, Justin?
That's pretty out of bounds for me. I'm a sneaker guy, so sneakers
it doesn't
maybe
affect
I
his
could
tone.
talk about. No, but watches, nothing in there as far as I know.
I mean, when you play in time like John Mayer does, I don't know why he needs that watch, but that maybe that can be another episode, another guest. But I just wanted to clear that up.
A Rolex with a built-in metronome.
Exactly. That's really my main first question. Brian, do you got anything for Justin to get started?
No, I don't think I do. I will have a few questions, but no, I mean, not that I can think of right off the bat.
Okay. Well, I think that we should start in a place that I think is going to satisfy any potential fans of John Mayer. And I think we should start, Justin, maybe in the order of what is currently on the John Mayer rig. Now, I know he's doing a solo tour right now, and for people that are listening only, Justin is wearing a sweatshirt which has got the John Mayer solo logo on it. Presumably you went to one of the show dates where he was on tour solo. What is the rig for the solo tour here? And I even saw that he announced he's going to be playing in Japan for New Year's, which is cool. Got a couple of dates at the Blue Note.
Super small venue, I think, like 300 people or
yeah,
something like
very
that.
small,
which is super cool.
Yeah. So what is the rig as of today, as we know it?
Well, the rig as of today is kind of interesting for John. As we know, he just has performed Crossroads, and then now he's back on the solo tour again. And the solo tour is primarily 99% acoustic performances. You might get one actual electric guitar performance a night, which is kind of what my specialty is, more or less, in terms of John Mayer gear and everything like that. For the multiple pedal boards he's got going on, it's mainly vocal effects when he's performing acoustically. You'll actually notice him having like them inside the H9, the new one, the dual
H90.
The H90, that one. He's got that one on where you can notice he does like certain vocal effects and things through that even. But primarily for electric guitar, you're seeing him with a triple overdrive setup, where the great debate with John Mayer and his overdrive sound is it tube screamer into a Klon Centaur, or is it a Klon Centaur into a tube screamer? And he's kind of ended that debate for all of us, which is really interesting because he's got an Ibanez TS10 going into a Klon Centaur, going into another Ibanez TS10. And it's the same thing for Crossroads. He's now been running that kind of setup where sometimes for bass, lead kind of tones, he'll run one TS10. And then for solos, he'll stack the Klon and then the second TS10 on top of it. So we're getting all three on. And that's kind of been the main component of John's pedal combination at this point. Of course, you still have an Octopus on his pedal board. You still have the Keeley Katana Clean Boost in the mix as well. He was using the Boss Delay Machine 101 for Crossroads as well very recently over the Providence Chrono Delay for kind of that longer delay sound. But that's kind of some things electric guitar wise we've seen John using very recently.
Nice. So as you said, for the acoustic stuff, it's not so much electric. Could you go through the Crossroads rig, or was it just simply that, just the tube screamers that are on either side of the Klon, the Octopus, and the Boss Delay Machine?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. Add a Strymon Flint into the mix there, and you have essentially the Crossroads pedal board.
So the trio pedal board 2023, basically.
Yeah, it's very simple. Before, when he performed at Love Rocks back in March, he had what we believe was one of the old school full tone custom Univibes on his board as well. And then you can have, like, for this performance, he had a Boss CE2 on as well for Crossroads for some nice chorus when they performed They Love Each Other from the Grateful Dead, that cover. Oh, nice. He used a lot of chorus for that performance as well, which was cool. But that kind of encompasses the main components on his rig right now. And then, of course, swapping things in and out as he needs.
And what was the amplifier setup for the Crossroads thing?
So for Crossroads, it's really cool. We're seeing him go back to one of his old... I hate using the word vintage for something from the 2000s, but one of his old school 2-rock custom reverb signatures. This one's just, it's been written number 83, as 83 being just kind of a big year for John, essentially a number that's just very important for him. So it's kind of the first 2-rock that they started slightly tweaking and adjusting for him, but it's essentially a custom reverb signature V1. His 64 Vibreverb, which is one of my favorite amps of John's. And then as well, Dumble Steel String Singer 004 was also used.
Nice.
Wow.
It would seem from hearing you talk about this stuff that you and John are just texting every day. But from watching your videos, I know that you have to be a very meticulous, dedicated, and you have to be able to put in the time for this. And from seeing some of the videos on your YouTube channel, which is very good, by the way,
thank
you. From my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you're basically going through social media, through other YouTube videos, and you're just getting any angle you can of, in this instance, the Crossroads shows, and trying to see, like, when's he hitting this pedal and where was that on his board from this angle. I think it was the middle switch of the DM101. Then he turns on the reverb side of the Flint and turns off this. Like, it's meticulous, and I'm just curious, is that how you do it? And for the Crossroads video on your channel, how many different videos, how many hours of looking at stuff did you have to go through to come up with a really quite accurate depiction of what was going on?
Yeah, it honestly depends on how blessed we get with footage from all these performances and everything like that and what comes up. Sometimes it takes a very long time and, a couple hours of sorting through YouTube, kind of looking through videos to see if you can get a good angle or not, and then taking multiple videos, splicing them together at times when people stand up right at the moment you thought he was going to press something, and then the people in front get up to go grab a beer, and then you're like, oh, come on, like that would have been the perfect shot. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where you're just constantly looking for good angles and everything like that, scouring different professional photographers' pages as well to see if they had like a really clear shot the odd time. And then sometimes even when they do know when Chloe Weir was taking photos of the Dead and Company's final tour, there was one photo she actually completely blurred out his pedalboard on. So I think it was kind of a little cheeky where they're like, all right, this is going to be too good of a shot of his board for you guys, so let's just put a little.
Is he a bit like mysterious about it? Like, I know he talks about his gear every once in a while, but it's not like he's consistently doing like, these are my settings for this song, this is a behind the scenes at the studio with my exact gear, and when I like, some artists will do that, but does he ever do that type of thing with his? He seems to like hold it a little close.
He does, and I think he is very much aware of kind of the mystique and like heavy tone chasing that involves his gear, and kind of as the great modern day guitar hero, really, it's kind of, he's always getting kind of investigated in terms of what gear he's using and the sounds he's getting and everything like that. So he is a bit secretive, and from what I kind of know, talking to different people in kind of the same space and everything, he likes to have fun with everyone who chases his sound and kind of mess with them a little bit, and he kind of almost enjoys trolling people, from what I am kind of aware of. So
I bet his Klon is actually a rehoused Metal Zone.
It probably is. Yeah.
You heard it here first, guys.
Yeah. So I'm curious this, because I heard a rumor. I don't know if it's true or not. Does he, all of his drive pedals, I heard, like, paint them black, so sometimes people don't know what the pedal is? Because I heard that I've heard people say he's done that. I'm like, I've never seen a photo, but again, it's getting a photo of his board is impossible.
Yeah, he started doing things like that around, I want to say, the 2019 World Tour is when we first saw him starting to kind of black out different pedals, but not just drive pedals. There was the rehearsal, which Mason, I know you went to with our mutual friend Gabe as well. Shout out to Gabriel. And the pedal board he used there didn't have anything blacked out. You could clearly see exactly what was on it. The moment the first show happened, all of a sudden, a bunch of pedals were painted black, no labels on them, no logos, nothing. They're just a bunch of black boxes with all almost the exact same knobs. And it was very interesting, but because we've seen shots of his board in the past and just being able to kind of discern by the layout of what's on his board, you can kind of tell, okay, that's a Providence Delay 80s, but it's just black and the knobs have been switched. And he started doing that with a bunch of different pedals. And when John was actually talking about promoting Sob Rock and some of the gear he was using, someone in a live stream with the Session IG, I'm not sure if he still does streams or anything, but he did a full breakdown of all the stems of Last Train Home. And in that, someone asked John, why do you black out pedals? And he essentially said that is because he doesn't want, and to quote, he doesn't want the price of shit going up just because he wants to give it a try. And, you'll see people on Reverb put in, as used by John Mayer or something like that right in the title. And I think that really irks him, that people are kind of seeing what gear he's using and then just trying to make a quick buck off of that. Mm-hmm. So that's mainly the reason from John's direct perspective, right from him. And so he tries out something that's kind of hard to find, a little bit rarer, like the CE2 even. He painted that black. But then the Klon, I think, was just, from what I've heard from Zach from Mythos, he talked about it briefly, that John's Klon had kind of broke or something, and then they ended up rehousing it just in black to kind of go with some of the black scheme that he was kind of going for.
So did Mythos rehouse that for him, or did somebody else do it?
Someone else did. I don't know who. I have a lot of speculation that Josh Scott is involved in some of the stuff that's going on because they're very close. I feel like Josh would be kind of someone who knows, and Josh has come out and said too, it's a real Klon Centaur that's in there. A lot of people thought it was the Cherrytown for a while, but John can afford. He's got millions of dollars on his wrist, right? He can spend the money on a Klon and get a couple backups.
Right, right. Crazy. Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, that you're doing here, Justin, and I think that sort of this documentation that you're doing, this may come in handy, because I think if there's anything that we could learn from the Grateful Dead folks, is that a lot of the people that were meticulous about sort of documenting the history and evolution of, let's say, Jerry Garcia's gear and stuff like that, they came to benefit from that a lot in the future, like, with books and things like that, because there was only a limited number of people that had sort of a concert by concert or year by year information around how things evolved. And so, who knows if maybe you'll be called on at one point in the future to have to recount, what was used in November of 2021 with whatever tour it was and what gear was used, because they want to get back to that sound. So I think it's a really cool thing that you're doing, and I just love the the nerdiness of it for myself and just kind of like being like, oh, that's interesting. Like that's what he's using. And one thing I wanted to say before we break for a moment for sponsors, I wonder what your perspective is on how much it actually helps that he does that, or whether it actually just stokes the flames more to try to obscure what it is, because ultimately, like, people who really know, pedals fairly well, or somebody like you is ultimately going to figure out what it is. And the idea that it's supposed to be somewhat, secretive maybe just makes people want it more than if it were just something that were, in plain sight and there was no, concerted effort to try to obstruct what it is. Do you think that it has the inverse effect that he thinks it does by obscuring pedals?
I think it does. I think it just kind of adds to the whole mystique around his tone. And sometimes he gives off the perception that he isn't a gear guy, but then you look at the gear he chooses, his amp selection, everything, how meticulous he is with his sounds, the different pedal boards and what's on them from, sometimes show to show, they're changing and evolving on a large scale tour. It's clear he's a gear guy. He just is. And it's clear as day. And I think when he blacks out certain pedals, or like you say, he blurs out a certain photo that's too good to just give us for free kind of deal, I think it just kind of adds to the mystique. And it's kind of, I hope for him it's a little bit fun as well, where on his end he's like, all right, I'm going to make this a little bit harder for these guys, and let's see how long it takes him to kind of figure this out. And it makes me have a lot more fun doing it and trying to actually do it. Because if you just did a bunch of rig rundowns every year, it'd be like, all right, cool, that's what he's using. No, I think everyone would be like, no big deal, let's just move on from it. But I think it's a balance too of, in my mind, at least with the videos I make, trying to also respect his privacy at certain times. When the tour, I don't want to go in, I might know night one exactly what was on the board, but out of respect for John and to not annoy him as well, I don't want to go and sometimes reveal, the morning after the very first show of a tour, what exactly he was using. And like, let's just let the tour go on for a while, and then I'll come out and I'll talk about it to again, give him, people aren't just blowing it up and dissecting it after one show. I think sometimes there's a balance in that way too.
Well, I want to continue with this conversation, but before we do, I want to talk about a few sponsors that make the podcast possible every single week. The first of which are our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary. And if you can see Brian Omilion right now, if you're watching over on YouTube, you know that he is seated and placed in the Guitar Sanctuary. He basically lives there, and he's building pedal boards all day long for your viewing pleasure on Instagram and various social media channels. And if you decide that you want to acquire some of the John Mayer gear that is actually available to you because it is a newly built product, much of that would be available from our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary. And Brian Omilion could be the guy that would put that pedal onto a pedal board and make it look beautifully routed with channels of cables that look like super highways in Los Angeles, California. He does a beautiful job wiring all those pedal boards. So do check out our friends over at theguitarsanctuary.com. See what they have to offer. You can head in there in McKinney, Texas if you'd like, or shop online. Also, our friends over at the Sweetwater Gear Exchange. The Gear Exchange is an amazing program where it allows you to have a peer-to-peer selling platform to be able to take all of your used gear, sell it to other people. And the coolest thing that they have that really separates them from Reverb or eBay is that you don't have to pay any seller fees so long as you decide to take your earnings and put them on a Sweetwater gift card. You can maintain 100% of everything that you earn so long as you do that. It's a great way, if you have something new that you want to buy, to sort of create your own layaway program. You sell your gear that you don't use, you acquire these gift cards that you're piling up this money, and then you can redeem it all on the thing that you want. Go over and check out sweetwater.com/used. You can set up an account for free, get buying and get selling. Also, our friends over at monocreators.com. Now, Mono makes some of the best gig bags in the business. Grant also swears by their pedal boards. They make some really great accessories. I saw that they just recently released a new power supply, very sleek and slim. I haven't tried it yet, but it looks absolutely amazing. It appears to be a switch mode power supply for those of you that are wondering what style of power supply it is. And they have some great stuff. I use their double gig bag all the time. In fact, I had a gig at a wedding over this weekend, and I used one of their acoustic gig bags for the first time, and I was absolutely in love with it. Made it easy to transport, easy to get around, and not as heavy as the case that would ordinarily come with my Gibson J45. So shout out to Mono for making great stuff, and you can own some great stuff from Mono as well by using the discount code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, and get 10% off your entire order. Now back to the great Justin Jeske. So Justin, we talked a little bit about the John Mayer gear as it is today, and talked a little bit about the trio, talked a little bit about obscuring pedals, talked a little bit about the solo rig, although mostly acoustic and vocal processing equipment. I want to go into talking about if we were to get John Mayer's rig identically, we were to get every single component, and I think that there's a few people that have gotten pretty close. What do you think if we're taking the element of practice, because we know that there's always the get off my lawn people that are always going to say, well, you just need to practice if you want to sound, like John Mayer. If we're taking that element out of it, and we're sort of just restricting to gear, how much do you think having the exact gear is going to kind of get you in the zone, or do you feel like there's sort of just like pedal archetypes, so to speak, that are still going to get you there without having the exact same gear? What do you think sort of the balance of that is, sort of based on your experience and also really being familiar with the gear that John uses?
Excuse me, I'll say this. I've never failed more brilliantly in trying to sound like John Mayer than the day I got my 2-Rock. That's kind of the very first thing that always comes to mind when people talk about gear and what kind of gear you need to get and everything. I think pedals take up so much of everyone's mind space, and what's the difference between this Blues Breaker clone and this one? But when your amp rig isn't fully fleshed out a little bit more, those differences aren't as important, or maybe need to be as prioritized as, getting your amp rig sort of set up and everything like that. So as long as you have like a really good, clean Fender style amp, Dumble style amp, 2-Rock or a 2-Rock kind of esque amplifier, I think with really just generalizations of gear, you can get very, very close. Of course, like you say, the hands obviously play a role. Practicing being able to play the gear is something that's incredibly important as well, something I still am constantly working on and everything, as we all are. But I think from someone I took Mayer's Sob Rock pedalboard and replicated it completely 1-to-1. I had every single component identical on that rig. The Vemoram 808, Klon Centaur, TS10, everything, Mark 1 Aquaplus, all identical. Did my best to kind of figure out the signal chain, and it sounded great. But it was more of a technical exercise and something that was incredibly fun for me to try and do than to actually really make the sounds to sound like John Mayer. Like the Strymon Flint, even any good harmonic tremolo will get you a beautiful trem sound for gravity. Any, really nice chorus can do the Last Train Home, Boss CE2 sort of thing. Any tube screamer can get you the TS10 sound more or less. I think it's more about ballparking in general is what people need to be kind of more, kind of concerned with. You don't need the exact components at all.
So if you were going to set up sort of let's say the 5 pieces, I'm not going to restrict you to 5 pieces, but if you're going to say what the core pieces were that you would need if you're somebody who is interested in chasing the John Mayer sound and you want to have sort of the core elements in place, what are those pieces that you would need kind of from start to finish pedalboard wise?
So this is always kind of interesting to go through, like whenever, because I get a ton of people messaging me, especially on Instagram, asking, oh, how should I build a pedalboard this way? Or on Facebook, I'll see people asking the questions, or different forums. And I always like to say it does somewhat depend on the era of Mayer tone you might be chasing. A lot of people really chase the trio, or they really chase Continuum, or then other people born and raised Paradise Valley is their jam. So you always kind of have to take into account what era you're chasing after when it comes to Mayer's tone, because it's evolved. Even though it's structurally the same, it has evolved. But if you're looking to build just a standard kind of cover all the bases Mayer sound, I think the 2 most important pedals are your drive pedals. So something that's a tube screamer is an absolute must. If you had to have one pedal into a clean amplifier, tube screamer is for sure the one to cover all your lead sounds. Then depending either a Klon Centaur or a Blues Breaker style overdrive if you're more continuum, blues breaker if you're more kind of post continuum born and raised era to present day, claw and centaur. From then on, maybe a clean boost in front of that as well, depending on, especially if you gig or play with people a lot, the clean boost becomes a lot more relevant at that point when you can just lift your volume instead of just, if you're playing just at home, turning your amp up a little bit more or not really needing it. But a clean boost to stack into the gain pedals is, always nice for those larger solo tones as well. And then I always am a big advocate of longer delay. I think with John, especially in his tone, a lot of people really think that the Aquapus slapback is incredibly important, and it is, but it's not used as frequently as a lot of people think. A lot of people think it's used always on when it isn't. It's used for songs like Vultures, Wild Blue, where he wants that slapback, and even when John plays, it's very hard to hear, if almost impossible to hear that very subtle slapback. But I always advocate for a longer delay to kind of do, if you listen to Where the Light Is with the P. Cornish TES on the Belief intro, to be able to replicate sounds like that with a longer delay, I think is very important. Then maybe slapback, or then that kind of fourth and fifth position can be choose what you want and what songs are ones you're trying to play. Like, do you want to do I Don't Trust Myself with Loving You and Rosie? Maybe then a Qtron style pedal. Are you wanting to perform like Gravity or play around with that? Then add a harmonic tremolo. Certain things where you kind of have that fourth and fifth position. If you're limiting yourself to that kind of board, at least, you can kind of play around with what songs you're really chasing after in tones. But I say the core drive section, longer delay, possibly slapback. I say that's kind of your main bulk.
There's something you said there in the signal chain that caught my ear, which is around his katana. I know I'm known for ages that he's used the katana, the script version, but you had mentioned that he put it before his drives. Is that the case? Like he runs boost into drives, so it's less maybe about volume and more about saturation rather than boost after the drives? Did I hear you right?
Yeah, and the katana as well is very song dependent, and even just when he kind of feels he needs it, depending on the tour. He used to have, for the Born and Raised Paradise Valley era, he had two katanas on his pedal board. Both were in front of the drive pedals, and one was used as a pure clean boost, kind of when he needed it to stack with solos or to add for a song like Vultures. When he wants a bit more of a punchy, clean sound, he'll just have the katana on for the entire performance. But then for other guitars like the Black One, he would always throw the leveler Keeley katana on just to kind of bring up the weaker sounding pickups and everything with the Black One, so that he just had more of a consistent level across the board with all of his different guitars. So there's lots of different uses, but essentially katana's always out in front, mainly clean boost for songs like Vultures, Belief, even for like the main parts of Belief, he'll leave it on the entire time. And then for bigger solos as well, he'll then stack the katana on in front of the drive pedals as well to kind of get into more saturation and things like that. He's done clean boosts after post drive, but it's a lot more uncommon and something that's not as really in the mix.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too. Good grab.
No, it's just it's really curious because we're obviously talking about the gear he's using and what are the core elements or the foundational pieces of the gear. But even in this little example, and we talk pedal boards and signal chain on the show, you could have every piece of gear, but if you don't have a sweet clue about his signal chain or the settings in which he runs them or how he runs them with different guitars, I mean, you might as well be using a different pedal board or going after a totally different artist. And so I think it's cool to hear you talk obviously about the gear itself, but in my mind, more importantly, about the signal chain and the general settings, because I feel like that's 90% of the battle in terms of getting that sound. And so it's interesting. Any other kind of, how he's actually using the gear, tips or tricks you've picked up over the years in this realm?
Tips and tricks for how he's using the gear. That's
I know on one of the videos you mentioned one of the videos, even on the Black One guitar, he tends to favor neck, and I think you mentioned position 4, but the bridge is really rare as an example. And so I thought, I was like, oh, that's actually really interesting to hear some more details on pickup selection, like any of those types of things in the sound.
As far as off the top of my head, which is where all this information comes from, we'll laugh about Rolodexes. It's for me, it's all just in here that I go off of after all this time of researching and deep diving in. I think the main thing that maybe is a tip and trick for a lot of people as well is stage volume and how loud John actually plays. Because when you look at his settings and everything, speaking of that, you try and translate it to your rig, or even me when I was running it through a 2-Rock and a vintage Bandmaster and stuff like that with everything. You still have to tweak everything to account that you're not playing a massive arena and your amps are not screaming. I'd be deaf if I played it in my house that loud and stuff. So you have to kind of take into account with your rig, especially with drive pedals as well, and what kind of amplifier you're using in general. You kind of have to go maybe use his settings as your base and then tweak from there using your ear to what actually sounds appropriate and more like his tone. Because if you take his Tube Screamer settings into a completely different amp, it probably won't sound identical to what John's does. Little things like that. Even the Aquapus, a lot of people I've seen take the Mark II and Mark III, the more accessible versions of the Aquapus, and they'll try and just copy John's Aquapus settings. But right now, at least since Born and Raised Paradise Valley, he's used the AP1 version of the Mark I, and the pots are actually reversed. So if you just visually look at it and copy settings, you're going to get this really wacky, almost self-oscillating sound. And then you're going to think to yourself, how the hell does that work? And it's like, well, if you actually look where the pots are, they're swapped, they're in opposite places, and then the one pot's actually reversed. If you look at it. So little things like that to keep an eye out.
Which is the knob that's reversed? Is it the mix or is it like the feedback?
Off the top of my head.
That's all right. It's not important. Usually on the Aquapus, it has like a graduated like silk screen, so it like gets wider where doesn't it where like where the effect is more exaggerated. So maybe you could use that as your visual cue if you're wondering.
I believe its mix is on the other side and then delay and then it's reversed. Okay. AP1. I'm looking at my AP2 version, which is the same as the modern ones.
And he's used the, I feel like I've heard you say he's used the AP2 or the AP3 on certain boards. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's kind of one of the bigger mysteries that I still haven't figured out in terms of why on a lot of smaller pedal boards he's using the Mark II Aquapus when, yes, I've even mentioned when we're talking how the Aquapus slapback can get kind of lost and it's very hard to hear, but there's still between the original Mark I sound, how it overall will sit in the mix and the darkness of those repeats and what it does to your tone versus the modern versions. But on a lot of pedal boards, he's using a Mark II version of the Aquapus. So me and a few of my friends in the John Mayer gear community have a couple wild theories that, well, maybe it's rehoused Mark I in a Mark II enclosure or something like that, where someone who's so meticulous about his gear to use the Mark II, which, if we're getting this pedantic almost in this detailed, doesn't quite sound the same. But maybe John just doesn't care, and we're deep diving a little more than he does into it. But
yeah,
I sometimes find that hard.
I'm surprised more people just don't go and get a vintage DM2, because I think that would actually be a closer approximation to the AP1 than a lot of the subsequent reissues of it. Because if you find one with the 3005 chip, that was basically what George Trips was trying to do, is just make a modern replica of a DM2 that was true bypass, and so, I'm surprised more people don't do that. I feel like it's closer, because I've had AP1s at various times before they got really expensive, and through a true bypass looper where I could fully bypass the buffering of the Boss pedal, they were pretty indistinguishable. And when the prices got really high, I sold it because I was like, the DM2 is kind of like the original, but for some reason, because of the pedigree of John Mayer, it's exceeded the prices of what a vintage DM2 would be. But that was the origins for that product. I want to continue going in just grilling Justin with more John Mayer related questions. But before we do, I want to break for ads. I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about a few more sponsors that make the podcast possible every single week.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we are so appreciative of our sponsors. As Mason says, they make the podcast possible. And in your gear hunt and your building, you're dreaming up ideas of your next replica John Mayer rig or whatever rig that you're working on, what you're wanting to build next. A lot of times, you want the quality connectors and cabling and materials and parts. You don't build a car on cheap parts. You don't build a pedalboard and everything on cheap cabling and everything. So Bestronix, the guys over in Chicago, are definitely our go-to for cables and plugs and all sorts of patch panels. I just saw Grant and them. They just got a patch split, a multi-pin connector bay from the guys over there because they're the best. No pun intended, but kind of intended. But they have a discount code, Dutch Airs, for 10% off. It's DACHAIRS for 10% off all their stuff. Go check them out. They supply all sorts of cabling, pancake plugs, straight plugs, right angle plugs, all sorts of connectors, the 2.1 millimeter barrel plugs that we use for power cables that everyone asks about. Go check them out. They're simply the best, and you won't be disappointed to talk to Brad. Brad is great. Another one is the guys over at Stringjoy. If you're a string destroyer like Mason, as he says, and you constantly are going through strings, or as I've joked about it, you're a couple packs a day guy when it comes to strings, that you're constantly gigging or you constantly need to change out strings and you need a plethora of strings. They are, as we say, the Netflix or the Redbox or whatever you want to call it of strings, and they can, mail you a subscription. You can get 10 packs in a month and then you're set for those gigs, or you can get, you try them out or everything. But they have a discount code BOARDS for 10% off. Go use that discount, try the strings, subscribe to them, and you won't be upset. Add a little joy to your life. Back to you, Mason.
All right. Thanks, Brian. So, Justin, the next thing I want to get into with you is I think that, so an interesting thing that I run into, and this is even with, I would consider myself a fan of John Mayer, and I talk often when I'm with friends and colleagues that are equally sort of tonally minded. And the pushback that I often get is and I think that this is pretty common, even if I were to do a YouTube video on a John Mayer style pedalboard or whatever it may be, is that people are typically dismissive of John Mayer as an artist by calling him a Stevie Ray Vaughan ripoff. I think that is the most common characterization that I see that would undermine what he's doing. And I've always thought that this was a pretty sloppy comparison, because there are very few songs that I've heard John Mayer play where there's a solo that really resembles a Stevie Ray Vaughan solo. And other than the fact that he's using a Strat and a Dumble, certainly you could say that he has influences there. But I don't really get I would say that the proximity of a Philip Sayce to a Stevie Ray Vaughan is a much closer comparison than a John Mayer to Stevie Ray Vaughan. What are your thoughts and opinions around this sort of comparison, and what are examples where you think maybe there is some similarity to like a Stevie Ray Vaughan tone, and then maybe where do we even hear other influences, like we had talked about before we started recording about sort of the Clapton comparison, which is really, I think, a lot closer, at least in the last couple of albums, as far as the solo compositions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up Philip Sayce. I think,
well, he's Canadian, so we had to pay you respect for that.
Yeah, lots of great guys. You had Joey Landreth on a couple of weeks back, another great guy from Canada. I think if you're someone who thinks Mayer is strictly a SRV wannabe or rep off, go and listen to Philip Sayce. Go back and listen to any of John Mayer's recent live stuff. And I think that should almost be enough in and of itself to end the debate of someone who is truly 100% Stevie inspired in their playing and in their sound, like Philip, and he's brilliant, like otherworldly. But John is on a different level. And it's almost like John kind of pulls from different influences. We talk about Eric Clapton a lot too, and the Clapton thing has, I think, really become John's kind of main influence, especially as the years go on. Maybe early Mayer, a lot more SRV, where he'd cover Lenny a lot more. When he performed, a lot of his solos would have a lot more SRV kind of tones and playing to them, like Covered in Rain back from Any Given Thursday. It's one off the top of my head that's just a bit more SRV. Even playing one of his first guitars, the SRV signature Strat from the 90s. He'd play that with his rig, and it was just a lot more SRV inspired as a whole. But you listen to something like Sob Rock, which is so Eric Clapton in the way it's kind of done and everything, like a love letter to the 80s and that sound. I think there's so many more influences that John is just more than an SRV wannabe or an SRV copy. Even in a lot of his live playing, if you listen to any live footage, the Jerry Garcia influence now especially is huge in a lot of the stuff he'll play as well.
Yeah. And the only solo like I can really think of, and I may have messaged you this before, is I feel like Assassins has a very Stevie Ray Vaughan sound to it. Although I don't think he used a Strat for it, or at least when he performs it live, he uses like an Eddie Van Halen, like Wolfgang or something like that. Which you wouldn't normally associate it, but I think that sound to me sounds like a Stevie Ray Vaughan inspired solo. But I can't really point to, as you said, other than like Any Given Thursday and doing a Lenny, kind of introduction to what was that? That was Man on the Side was like it was the introduction to that. I don't see where there's this comparison. Like again, I think that Helpless was like the first song where there was like a clear Clapton like reference there, and even in the music video. On Sob Rock of Last Train Home, it was like basically sort of reinterpreting the Journeyman, like era Eric Clapton music videos. I can't remember which one, which Eric Clapton music video it was, but I remember like seeing it and being like, oh yeah, I recognize this. I've seen this like a Eric Clapton Vimeo, thing like. Vimeo. But yeah, it's bizarre to me. Like I feel like people who do that, it's like are they listening to what I'm hearing? Because it's like I don't know. Like anytime anybody hears a blues lick, is it automatically like referential of Stevie Ray Vaughan? Like I don't know. It's to me it seems lazy, and like it makes me think like, have you actually listened to John Mayer? Because this is not, vocals aside, there's really not a lot of Stevie Ray Vaughan here. So anyway, I was curious if you run into that in the work that you do, where people are just like, oh, why do you care about this? He's just a Stevie Ray Vaughan clone.
Oh, 100%. I think a lot of people either, some of the comments John's made in the past in interviews, or that he's the guy who wrote Your Body is a Wonderland, and people just still can't get over that, or how he used to be very much into the SRV thing. I think people still to this day dismiss him, which is such a shame, because when you think about him as, like I mentioned before, one of the biggest modern day guitar heroes out there, like the amount of people he's inspired to pick up a guitar and play music and just fall in love with it is, he is the number one guy from kind of our time, so to speak, and the people he's inspired. So it's kind of sad, honestly. But yeah, in the line of work I do, I get comments all the time, be like, oh, he's just an SRV wannabe, or he just is, trying to be Stevie. And like you mentioned with the Dumblelands, like he owns the Texas Flood amp, the Texas Flood Dumbleland. He owns that amplifier. When you look at certain other amplifiers he uses, like the 64 Vibe Reverb, or even just the TS10, Rene Martinez being his old guitar tech. A lot of gear influences are very Stevie, but then there's a lot of gear influences that are also David Gilmour and little nods to Eric Clapton in the studio and things like that, where he pulls from so many different people. I think, like we mentioned, it's just kind of hard to pinpoint, even Jeff Beck, the way he's done a lot of the, I guess I Just Feel Like solos live, and even Heartbreak Warfare to a slight degree with his use of the trem bar. There's a lot more to John than just pure SRV. And it's a lot of people just dismiss him of that.
One of the things I want to kind of finish on here as we kind of get toward the end of our conversation today is what would you say for you, tone wise, for John Mayer, would you say are your like top 5 kind of John Mayer tones? And this could be incorporated as a solo, this could be incorporated as just, the elements of a song. What are, if you're instructing somebody who, has never heard John Mayer before, and you're like, here are the 5 tones that you need to familiarize yourself with, what are you picking as the top 5?
This is always such a hard question to answer. And I know we talked about this before, and it's still something where I struggle. And for me, it changes quite constantly of, these are things you need to learn to kind of round John out. And I have to give a shout out to my friend Austin, who just got into John Mayer and just discovered him. And I sent him a whole YouTube playlist of all these deep dives and cuts, being like, you need to listen to like this live performance of this song because it's incredible. And, all this stuff. So for me, I think In Repair at Webster Hall is one that the guitar tone, especially on that solo, is arguably my favorite guitar tone Mayer's ever had. It's woody. It's just quintessential continuum sound. In Repair at Webster Hall is for sure one. For me as well, I think kind of trying to round John out a little bit more. I think I guess I just feel like live performance at Milwaukee in 2019. That's one I find myself constantly going back to with that psychedelic fuzz machine, that really old school Chennai fuzz unit that he's using. You get that really kind of interesting, almost octave fuzz kind of sound. That's a really great tone of John's. If you're thinking more higher gain 2019 tones as well, Helpless at the Forum. For me, the outro solo where he uses the Mesa Boogie Flux 5 as like a very high gain, stacking with the TS10 and the Klon. That's a really great, okay, it's not just a kind of more mellow bluesy tone. It's like he's stacking on a higher gain overdrive to really get in your face and get a really kind of loud, aggressive tone as far as lead sounds go. And then one I always love to recommend, but it's very hard to find footage of unless you have it on your computer like I do at this point, is the Going Down performance with the Rolling Stones. That lead tone is absolutely wild, back from 2012 with Gary Clark Jr. as well. That lead tone is just, the first time I heard it, I was floored. It's just a lot more aggressive and dirty, and it's kind of, at that point for me, it was like, all right, this is like a benchmark Mayer sound that is just otherworldly and absolutely incredible in all honesty. Couple more just kind of different ones that I think people should try and listen to if they can. His guitar tone from the Alexander 23 cover of Everyone Wants to Rule the World with that Jackson soloist. It's not what you normally think of as John Mayer tone, but man, when he's fluttering with the Floyd Rose, it's really cool. And it's something that's just very different and very unique, but something John is incorporating a lot more into his playing as time goes on, I think, is another really great example. Even just some of the changing performances on the solo tour, I think, are really great as well from like modern day. But, do most of these that you mentioned, do they have, are these available for people to watch on YouTube, or are some of them just like, secret bootlegs that nobody could watch except, the super fan? Most of them are available. The only one that is tricky to find is Going Down. There is actual footage from the crowd of that performance of Going Down with the Rolling Stones you can find. The actual professionally shot footage is a little bit more difficult to find. But the rest of them you can all find online. They're all. Do you have
handy
accessible
links that we might be able to include as sort of like referential for the ones that are just like readily available that we could put maybe in the show notes or description, so we could kind of have Justin's picks for kind of benchmark John Mayer tones?
100%. I can send some over later. Even Sweet Thing lead tone with Keith Urban. That Crossroads performance is one of my favorites. Or even at Don't Let Me Down with Keith Urban. Lots of great performances there. I'll throw in some, kind of ones that I think people should check out. Some hidden ones that are live footage that I've just found from watching so much live footage that I've got personal favorites of mine that I go back to and listen to. I'll shoot some over.
Beautiful.
Nice.
Well, one more thing, Justin, before we wrap today, that I want to talk about, and I think this would be good too for listeners to understand about what you're doing. You put together a documentary recently, and we talked about it a little bit before we started recording today. And first of all, very, very well done. But for our listeners, can you just tell us kind of a brief synopsis about the documentary and why it may be of interest to John Mayer fans if they're not already aware that it exists?
Yeah, so recently I put together, it's about an hour and a half long documentary on John Mayer's Black One guitar. Talk about an SRV influence that guitar is. That was essentially just me taking the history from the guitar being built, the design aspects, different interviews of John and John Cruz talking about the guitar, its history, kind of iconic performances and ones that are worthy of being highlighted throughout the years, and just documenting all these little mysteries around the neck pickup. That's pull pieces got lowered randomly. And the story is that the guitar just was dropped and the pull pieces got lowered. Do you buy that story or do you not? And kind of highlighting certain interesting things around the instrument, how it's had 3 different necks on it because the original neck started to warp, and now John has the original neck back on it because even John Cruz's replacement necks never really were the same in John's opinion in his hands. So just, it's essentially like a love letter to that guitar that really has helped inspire so many people along with John to pick up the guitar and play. And it's just a full documentary on all this crazy stuff. And
if you could give us like an overview, like what would you say are kind of like a few unique elements of the Black One guitar as far as like its features or what may make it sort of, I don't know, stand out from an ordinary, let's say, 60s custom shop Strat?
I think the Black One is just very unique, and the pickups that it has, they're low output, very SRV number 1 inspired. I'd say almost kind of something along those veins as the Black One in general. John essentially just wanted a black Stevie number 1, was kind of what he had initially wanted from what I know, at least in certain interviews and stuff like that with John Cruz. I think the main thing about that guitar is that just the tones John's gotten with it throughout the years. Like, it's the record of Continuum is that guitar. Yeah. He's used it on pretty much every single song. And that guitar's 4th and 5th positions especially are just absolutely magical. And I think it's more about what John has done with that guitar and the way that guitar sounds versus something like his 64 Strat, which is hotter and has a bit of a different mojo and vibe compared to that black Strat. I think is kind of what makes that guitar just special.
Do we know much about like how much it weighs, what the pickup readings are as far as like the output levels? Like, are we talking in the 5s? Are we talking low 6s? Like, do we know any information like that?
On John's actual guitar, no, unfortunately, and I doubt we ever will. They did the run of 83 Masterbelt Black One Strats, which are going to be extremely close in terms of the pickups, the weights and everything. I know some of those Black One Masterbelts, I have a couple buddies who have them. They can be a little bit on the heavier side, actually, interestingly enough, into the higher 7s for a Strat, low 8s, I believe. Pickup readings off the top of my head for those 83, I don't remember, but they're relatively low output.
And he also puts his pickups pretty low, like almost, like lower than I'd say a lot of people might put their Strat pickups, where his are pretty close to the pick guard as far as like the height. So he seems to be relying a lot on using the amplifier to do the work and not having the pickups necessarily like overdrive pedals or overdrive the amplifier with the output. Is that an accurate assessment of kind of his setup?
Yeah, definitely a lot more dynamic in terms of the guitars and the way they're low output, and then you have all those pedals and the amplifiers really doing the heavy lifting for sure. He doesn't rely on very hot pickups often.
And do you know much about like his setup preferences, about like, is he a high action guy, medium action? Most of his guitars, even though they have tremolos, they're either blocked or decked. Do you know what his kind of setup is as far as guitars are concerned?
I don't know that much on his setup, to be honest, because that's such a individual preference sort of thing, and how I like my Strat setup might be very different from John's. And so I've never personally, honestly, dived that deep into it. I think something that's worth noting is generally he'll have, the trem system will be pretty much decked, and then he'll have, 5 springs in the back. That's something I've looked into. But as far as his action and his setup and stuff, interesting enough, that's something I've never really dived that deep into, to be honest. So like I said, it's such a personal preference thing.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that like I've experimented myself with decking versus putting like a block in it like Clapton does, and just kind of seeing how it affects the tone, and even the number of the springs, can be an interesting experiment, because it almost creates like a reverb effect by having the springs in the back, especially if you open up the back plate and all that stuff. So I'm always curious what guys are doing, and what they're finding is an interesting way to kind of achieve their tones. But yeah, one day maybe we'll know how heavy it is. But it's funny when in doing a lot of these interviews with like session guys and stuff like that we do, I'm always shocked at like some of these guitars that are like used on a lot of hit records, and they weigh like 10 pounds, or like Strats that are just ungodly heavy, and for whatever reason it's just a good guitar. It doesn't matter if it weighs 7 pounds or it weighs 10 pounds. It was the guitar.
Yeah, it's super cool. One day, hopefully, we get some information more onto exactly certain details of some of his guitars.
One of the things I appreciated about the doco was the hearing all of the little insights into how the guitars changed over the years, and more importantly, the stories behind them. And it's just really interesting hearing, about the warped neck as an example, and what was going on there, and all the back and forth, all the behind the scenes stuff that was going on for him to, get to the point that he's at today, putting the warped neck back on the guitar. And again, I think, like you were saying, I think it lends itself to the fact that he really is a gear guy. He's picky. He knows what he wants. And if it's not quite there, he's not going to put up with halfway. You know what I mean? And so even, I think I could have this detail a little bit wrong, but I think in the doco you mentioned the tuners being swapped out or something like that, something that was on hand, the Perloid tuners and stuff, and just hearing why they were kind of around from SRV, kind of era, and then got put on that, and now they're on the whole run of guitars that he did with Fender because of that little thing that happened in the past. It's just really interesting hearing a lot of the stuff I would just assume it was like that from the factory. It's like, no, actually, there's more to it than that, and it's just cool hearing some of these details I never would have even considered, but they have quite a cool history behind them as well. And so, it was cool, man. And I appreciate you putting all that effort into the documentary. It's something I didn't know I needed to watch, and now I'm really glad I took the time. So it was awesome. So if you guys, even for those listening, I think it definitely is worth checking out, and I think you'll get some cool insights into, especially obviously that guitar, but John Mayer himself and why he makes some of the choices he does is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I had a cool experience. This is pre-pandemic. This was his world tour, I think it was, right? But 2019. So I got to go to his Dallas date with a friend, and we actually had the opportunity to sit in on sound check. So we get there, they're like, no, don't record anything, don't take photos, don't be respectful, sit down and be quiet. I was like, okay, Dad. And we were sitting there, and it was they were practicing a tune, and they kept playing the tracks, and the band was learning it, and I'm like, what are they doing? Like, they're learning a song. And I was like, oh wow, okay, that's ballsy, that to just learn a new song with your gig in 2 hours. And it was Carry Me Away. I think that was the name of his song. And he comes out after an hour, and they play a couple times, and they you can see, and this is something I think a lot of people, as much as we talk about gear, and I love gear, I love talking about gear, it's also I have to appreciate how creative he is and how brilliant he is in some of the stuff that he does and thinks about. Because sitting there for an hour and a half, my friend and I are our wives are just kind of are they're both musically inclined to, they sing, so they understood, but we're just blown away at how he's getting excited. It reminded me of being in a band when we came up with a new song, and we all kind of he was excited about the part, and they were jumping off of, yeah, let's do that. Oh no, I don't like that. I'm like, are we literally witnessing them finishing this song? And he ends with, yeah, I think we're gonna do it tonight. And I was just like, did they even finish? And he was just yeah, I like that. It was seeing the creative wheels turning. And I think that's a huge thing also to appreciate. His playing is amazing, and that's like the thing is people like will harp on his, oh, he's Stevie Ray Vaughan, oh, he's this. It's like he takes pieces from all these people he's learned from, but he's also putting his own take on it, which is amazing. So it was a cool experience to see all of that happen, because I'm such a behind the scenes documentary. I watch every documentary you can watch because I love behind the scenes. So seeing that was cool. It also like humanizes them. We're all humans, I understand that, but it like really humanizes them. It's like, oh my gosh, like yeah, like he's figuring out what tone sounds better and what guitar. He swapped out multiple guitars and those kind of things. But it was it's cool to hear and see people like you that are diving into showing other people that are really interested and really want, don't have the time to sit down and look at every single video, but really want that tone. And I'm always going to say, like, tone is also, it's in the hands. Every rig is going to sound different with the player, but it's really cool to get a baseline of how a rig could sound also off of videos, off their dock and everything. So I do appreciate what you're doing.
Yes. And we will make sure that we have all of Justin's credentials listed in the show notes and as well in the description. So if you're interested in checking out what Justin is doing, you will have all the resources that you need. We'll also post all of his recommended sort of benchmark tones for John Mayer that will also be included in those same locations. So please do check that out. Subscribe to his channel. He does a lot of really great content and deep dives. And we are glad that you are in this YouTube space so that you take all the legwork out of what we would normally have to do to try to figure out the same stuff. So thank you, Justin, for your contribution and being here today. And we will sign off for this episode and make our way a little bit further down the road to Tone Town, hopefully with a little bit more information and understanding about one of the guitar greats, John Mayer. Until next time, we will see you guys.
See ya.
Yep.
Thank you so much for having me on, everyone. It was a pleasure.